Yeah. If you look at the world today, it seems like the politics and the economics of all countries are unable to be separate from each other. What does this mean? This means that in a largely globalized society, where we are more, where the rise of things like populist sentiments or governments being in control of the entire economics of individual countries, it's so much harder to be able to separate the kind of economic growth that ASEAN wants from the politics that is necessary to be intervened. What does this mean? In ASEAN or in Southeast Asian countries, there are essentially three contexts that we operate upon. The first is the rise of populist sentiments in places like the Philippines, where naturally in these areas, a lot of the governments that are currently in power breed and foster a lot of these populist sentiments to be able to control a lot of the people that exist. The second thing is that there are new inclusions of members of new states that are naturally varying in viewpoints, especially with countries that are operating in different political environments. Things like the inclusion of Timor-Leste, for example, in ASEAN. And the third thing is that when we are in a largely globalized world, the trade that happens or the extent by which you have economic power relies a lot on whether or not the politics is something that is stable or the politics is agreed upon by people that you are trading with. What does this mean? This means that in our world today, it seems like we are unable to separate these two things. Therefore, it is time, if ASEAN really wants to make sure that Southeast Asia becomes a global powerhouse in its economics, it has to be able to intervene regardless of the political disjunct that exists. What then do we think our counter policy is? We think that when we abandon this ASEAN way, we think that we're going to draft a new constitution for ASEAN, make sure that there's an ample transition time for all individual member states to be able to agree and adjust a lot of their policies. And we think that what will take place is rather a majoritarian point of view, where regardless if it's not unanimous, as long as it's majoritarian, we think that we are able to access things like ASEAN resources to do things like interventions if it's necessary, or force countries to have specific economic policies to make sure that they are better in that sense. We think that the burden of opening government is not to tell you that all the processes will be perfect and there will not be any disagreement at all, because we think that's natural within countries with varying interests. We think that our burden is that the ideas that ASEAN wants are no longer in line with the current trends and the current ways that economics work. Therefore, it's no longer beneficial for us. But before I move on to my three arguments, go.
What incentive does Malaysia and Singapore have to militarily intervene for the Rohingya crisis?
Okay, so if they have no specific incentive, that's exactly the point. They have no incentive. That's why we're unable to do anything. But if a lot of the other countries want to be able to do something because they think it's better for Myanmar that they largely rely with in trade, then we think that it's more important for ASEAN to do this. Three arguments. One, why we think that they're heavily related to each other, therefore it's more likely that they want each other to succeed and stay within ASEAN. The second thing is that the ASEAN way is naturally detrimental to the capability of countries individually to grow. And the third thing is that we have to strengthen ASEAN because it's the only actor that can protect Southeast Asia. Let's go to my first argument. We think that largely ASEAN has benefited from the mutual growth of each other. What does this mean? We think that for example, we think that in 2012, around 200 million people, or 33% of ASEAN population, had more disposable income simply because they had more access to things like trade routes, things like technology that comes from the individual ASEAN conferences that exist. The second thing is that education and a lot of business opportunities sparked up more when there were more conventions and more ability for ASEAN countries to help each other, especially since the dynamic of these ASEAN countries is that there's already one developed country that exists that are able to help everybody else. The country of Singapore, for example, sharing their technology and their business and their economic knowledge to all these other countries. The third thing is that there were more trade routes and free trade agreements that were able to exist because of this. Even the existing ones that are currently happening right now, like the RCEP, where ASEAN nations have more leverage because they are a collective, rather than entering bilateral trades with things like the United States, that they are unsure whether or not they have the same bargaining power. We think that the conclusion of this argument is simply to say that we need all the countries to be able to grow. We are heavily reliant on all of them succeeding, making sure that they are successful at the end of the day. I already took a point, sit down. Why then do we think that the ASEAN way is naturally actually detrimental to this reliance. We think that ASEAN is essentially, we think that a lot of the time, your politics and the nature of your environment within your country is something that will largely hamper your economic power. What does this mean? Number one, people's willingness or the human capital that exists. If people are protesting on the ground or they're unsafe given the conditions of the government that they live in, things like the Philippines, for example, protesting against Duterte's economic policies like the BBB, or things like Myanmar and their Rohingya crisis, when they are unwilling to work and they are unable to find job opportunities, more likely the government will go downhill. Like in a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia where there are populist sentiments, inflation rate goes up, for example. The second thing is that when there are unsafe environments within these specific countries, things like trade is something that they can no longer access because they're prioritizing making sure that the politics is stable on the ground. But we think that what this looks like is that with the varying political stances of people within ASEAN, they are unable to curb or make a decision as to how we're gonna go about it, such that there's no action at all, like what happened in Myanmar, or things like South China Sea, where we have lost access to things like fishing routes simply because we are unable to intervene when China wanted to take the South China Sea from ASEAN. What does this mean? This means that if you really want to make sure that there's economic growth within countries, or at least the safety of the individuals within those countries, we need to act. But we cannot act if there has to be a forced consensus upon a forced unanimous decision upon individuals who naturally will not agree with each other given the differing cultures cultures, especially since these are things that we have to act on right now, and we cannot force a specific discussion to make it unanimous because we are leaving lives and we are leaving a loss in our economic power. The third thing, therefore, the conclusion is we think that this is harmful to the mindset and the principles that ASEAN has set because of the fact that we cannot intervene. We cannot intervene as a majority. The third thing is that we need to protect ASEAN in general. We think that all the other alternatives that exist for Southeast Asian countries, things like the United States or China, are far more harmful for these ASEAN countries. So if we're talking about as a global society or a neutral actor, the protection of these countries, we need to make sure that ASEAN is stronger in influence. Because the reason why China has power to dictate, like Cambodia, for example, to tell them not to vote against the South China Sea because they only need one vote against it to make sure that it's not something that we're going to act on. That's the reason why we are harmed as a society, because we allow the individual influences of of our member states to partake and to weigh heavily in the discussions that we are doing. What does this mean? In the world without it, we think that it's more natural that we get to protect these outside influences. And this can only happen if we prioritize ASEAN now. Now is the time to prioritize our member states. And we think that that can only happen if we try as much as possible to go against the ASEAN way. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to stop licking the wounds of our past and recognize that the colonizers no longer have any influence upon us. We think that as ASEAN countries, we no longer have to live in the fear of intervention. We understand that in this globalized world, intervention is a plausible thing in order to allow countries to grow. Why? Because we think in a world where you're more and more, when everyone is becoming more and more connected, there's more reason for you to be able to cooperate in the global setup. Because if you're unwilling to cooperate in the global setup, you threaten the existence of that very same order. We think that organizations should only exist if they do serve a purpose, right? So if he thus says that the harm here is that ASEAN will cease to exist, we're perfectly fine with that, right? Because if ASEAN no longer serves a purpose, or if ASEAN no longer pushes people forward, then we don't think the ASEAN should continue to exist. Why? Because if you think about it really, if they're not continuously gaining ground, or if they're not continuously improving the quality of life of of ASEAN nations, then they're still likely to leave. Why? Because of the interconnectivity that does exist within the ASEAN nations. For example, how the Philippines had a high inflation crisis recently, or how how the South China Sea has rerouting problems. These are several minute issues that often trickle down to other countries. So if you have a high inflation rate in one country, that oftentimes pulls down the prices of commodities and goods in other countries as well. We think that in this scenario, when you do face harms, but countries are unwilling to change themselves, for example, because Duterte is willing to vote against sanctions towards him, or Duterte is willing to say no to the intervention policies because we only need one vote to do so, then most likely the rest of the ASEAN will be forced to suffer because Duterte is unwilling to change. So we think on that scenario, if they are afraid that the harm will come to pass and then countries will begin to leave, it still happens on their side if they are unwilling to change to begin with. So we don't understand why for some reason why the ASEAN existing for the sake of ASEAN is a value to begin with. Because the value of ASEAN is its capacity to be able to help countries on the ground, or its capacity to improve economic standards. If it's unable to do that in its current status, then we don't think it should continue to exist regardless. But before I move on, closing.
Why will the regime, if you stay in office and other ASEAN nations deploy like sanctions or potentially even further worse activities on Philippines?
Look, if Duterte is populist, he will never change to begin with, right? That's why you need intervention to be able to push him in certain ways for him to act. And that only happens when you do have a majoritarian vote, right? So we think the parallel that they do have to accept is when they don't allow things like that to happen, Duterte can still run amok and allow things to, allow harmful practices that often pull down ASEAN without necessarily thinking of how it really does affect ASEAN, right? But we don't think it's also intervention all the time. Majoritarian doesn't have to mean that we have to intervene in every stuff, right? There still has to be a level of reason to why we're intervening. So if Duterte is doing certain actions that ASEAN is okay with, and it's not pulling down the rest of ASEAN, we don't think the first move of ASEAN is to directly intervene, but rather to the point when it does start affecting the rest of ASEAN, then that's most likely when ASEAN is then willing to intervene. So we don't think that the harm that people will instantly disagree will come to exist in the first place. But what does leader of opposition bring to you in this debate, right? He tells us that the ASEAN does intervene already to begin with, and he says his interventions are criticism, right? Look, criticisms are not a good way of intervening. Why? Because what effect does it really do? He tells us about the military juntas that happens in Myanmar, right? Look, the military junta is still in control. Your criticisms literally do nothing towards how these people act. So we don't think it comes about with fruitful change, but rather it's just a slap on the wrist or a banner statement to begin with to say we're doing something, but nothing is really done. So we think in that scenario, you are unable to get change to begin with. But if you do want to talk about China interfering and why China is a harm, the reason why it's a harm is because China gets to block policies that often are crucial to ASEAN. When you talk about the advancement of the West Philippine Sea, yes, I'm claiming that, then we think that it means that a lot of the routes that countries rely on are unable to pass simply because China allows it to become a military zone that blocks fishermen boats or blocks passage to other countries that begin with or imposes highly insane taxes towards them. It is easy for China to do it now because they only have to convince one country. It is so much more difficult to convince 6 countries out of the 10 compared to only having to convince one country to side with you. When you do have 6 countries, when you do have to try to convince 6 countries, you have to balance the interests of those 6 countries. It is a higher barrier for other international influences to be able to pressure member states in ASEAN to doing what they want. We think it gives us a more robust ASEAN that's more able to stand up against outside influences and more able to be able to defend ourselves from harmful practices. But then he tells us that this damages ASEAN, right? Because he tells us of the several iterations that failed before it. The reason why those several iterations failed before ASEAN was because ASEAN countries were unable to see the benefit that was provided to them. To them, they just saw that they were entering an organization that was not able to give them anything fruitful. But why is this different? Because the economic benefits has been established to begin with. All the ASEAN countries have firsthand seen the GDP growth that has gone within their first year, how they're able to become a rising tiger economy simply by joining the ASEAN. We think that this becomes a tangible economic benefit that they can clearly see. So when we think that the shift does happen, it's not like these countries will say, oh, I wasn't benefiting to begin with, because they know they're already benefiting to begin with. That's why they're still likely to stay, because they know the benefit is there. The only time they will likely be leaving is when they realize that the economic benefit is not worth the political incentive that they're entering to, which we think that most likely they're likely to see that the economic benefit is still greatly, right? Because that free trade agreement often means that they do have to look for alternative sources, and often means that they have to find another person they can be reliant on, because currently ASEAN is very reliant on each other. For example, how the Philippines relies on the rice trade coming from Vietnam and Thailand, or the same way how Thailand is relied on the garlic trade on Vietnam. These are economies that rely greatly on each other, and as long as they see the economic benefit, we don't think that these people will easily leave, as he do wants to stay with us. But then lastly, he says that the benefit of this is that he says that even if they do stay, they're less likely to do action, right? We think no. We think that if these people are likely to stay, we think these people are more likely to take stronger actions. Why? Because we still think that they do understand you have to be smart politically. So it's not every day where one country will just start targeting other countries. We think they still have to understand that there has to be a level of consensus to when they do want to intervene or when they do want to create action. Because if he says that the value is being able to stay together as ASEAN, then staying together means also making smart decisions of what you do, being able to weigh it politically. If you're unable to weigh it, then we think that that's just a bad ASEAN to begin with, and that ASEAN shouldn't exist. Why do we think that opening government quite clearly takes this debate? Opening government quite clearly takes this debate because we gave you the metric to which an organization exists, to which an organization should only exist if it continues to provide the benefit. The moment that its benefits become stagnant and harms become volatile that affects other countries, we don't think that as an organization, countries are willing to stay in because the buy-in is no longer enough. I think quite clearly, opening government has won this debate.
It's awesome. issues with ASEAN that exist in the status quo. The problem for them is that they are not comparative, because when ASEAN abandons the ASEAN Way, it is going to become significantly weaker as a bloc. That is because ASEAN is not the only game in town. When you change the incentives of the organisation and the countries that exist within it, they're more likely to seek out, for example, an alliance with China, or they're going to splinter and create other groups which are not going to have the same degree of collective bargaining power, which aren't going to have the same sort of democratic governments that are part of it, that give them the incentive to call out human rights abuses. 3 questions in the speech. First of all, why this weakens ASEAN. Secondly, on the economic benefits. And thirdly, how this harms domestic politics of member countries. On the first question of why this weakens ASEAN, we give you 2 reasons why nations' interests within the group are not necessarily aligned with the majority of countries in ASEAN. That's firstly because they're a diverse set of nations that have, different stages of development. Meaning, one thing that is good for the majority is not necessarily good for every country. Note also, this is a region with like a large degree of historical animosity. And then the second thing is that these countries value sovereignty to a large extent. These guys force them to adopt certain policies against their will in a region which has a far degree of historical animosity between these groups. This is likely to be taken very, very negatively by nations that have this enforced upon them. The next thing to note here is that a lot of the states that are part of this organisation don't trust international institutions in the first place, and are unlikely to respond well to like organisations such as the ICJ or the UN. What ASEAN does by through the ASEAN Way is getting countries like Myanmar and the Philippines to the table to be able to criticise them and to be able to place pressure on them. If they leave ASEAN or become less tied to ASEAN, that means these countries are going to become more insular, they get more violent, and they're less likely. Their economic development is likely to be harmed. The response we hear from opening government on this point is that criticism doesn't work. The first thing to say here is that it does work. It has worked in the past because ASEAN was able to get Aung San Suu Kyi out of house arrest, and that is because ASEAN values consensus and respect for these nations. That mean when it does criticize a member nation, that is taken to be a particularly significant rebuke and one to which nations are willing to respond. The other response we respond to our material is that other countries are not going to leave because of the economic benefits that being part of ASEAN brings them. 3 responses here. The first one to say is that the political incentives within these countries, because of the degree to which they value sovereignty and will see this as an affront to their national interests, meaning that they might leave regardless of any economic benefits that they are able to get. Secondly, like the second things go south, like the economy tanks because as has to happen at some point because it's like a boom and bust cycle, they're not going to see the value of remaining as ASEAN when the economy is in the toilet, and they're going to leave at that point. But thirdly, also note that a lot of our harms are not contingent on these countries leaving in the first place. We tell you that this harms ASEAN's authority to enforce its decisions in the first place, and therefore, countries just not going to comply with decisions that they don't want to comply with. Next, on economic benefits, this is where a large degree of the benefits in opening government's case relies. They say that success is tied to each other and they are able to act collectively in order to get more trade and become more prosperous. However, the first thing, again, is to note that these countries' interests are not always aligned with the majority of countries in ASEAN. And at the point where they're trying to enforce their will on other nations, they're not going to like this and either leave or not implement the politics domestically. That harms the collective action mechanism they rely on, because other nations are not going to want to enter into a trade agreement with a bloc that they cannot have certainty will implement that agreement in a unified way. Countries like the United States will not be able to weigh up the costs and benefits of a particular agreement when they do not have the certainty that every nation within that bloc is going to eliminate those subsidies or drop tariffs or whatnot. That means those countries are less likely to enter into trade agreements in the first place. That also the lack of certainty in terms of economic policy in this bloc means there's going to be significantly less investment in the region, because FDI flows go to where there is stability, where there is certainty. When you can rely on that bloc less, it becomes necessarily less stable, and you necessarily get less investment. Because then lastly, make the way up here. They probably get ASEAN making more decisions. However, those decisions are not going to be worth the paper they are written on. We are proud to stand behind ASEAN being able to make decisions as part of consensus that everyone is necessarily going to buy into. The last thing they tell us is you need to be able to intervene in countries in order to secure stability. However, now when these countries are not willing to comply with ASEAN, you need to turn to intervention as the first option. That is obviously bad for stability in the region, but also it is unlikely to occur because it is difficult, because it is hugely costly to the intervening states. These nations that do leave are likely to become much more rogue. I'll take closing.
Why do you think countries prioritize political benefits over economic benefits?
Because the politicians who are in power and control these countries in the first place have to respond to domestic political incentives. If there is a widening wave of populism driven by the fact that these countries' sovereignty is being abrogated, they're more likely to be pressured to leave or to flaunt the authority of ASEAN in order to placate the people within that country. Last question, and this is related to that: how this harms domestic politics of member nations. Note their model forces countries to adopt certain economic policies as is decided by the majority of ASEAN. That represents a massive abrogation of sovereignty for these nations, which populist politicians are going to be able to exploit. This narrative is going to be particularly potent in a region where nations have a large degree of historical animosity. They're going to be able to point to the other nations in the region and say, they are forcing us to adopt a policy that is against our national interest, and just generally people want to be in control of their country. This means these politicians are going to rise to power blaming these other nations. That has three harms. Firstly, these nations become more insular and anti-global. That is bad for economic development. Secondly, it is another mechanism by which ASEAN becomes weaker, because these politicians, when they gain power, are more likely to disobey ASEAN or leave it completely. And thirdly, because populist politicians also often drive up internal animosity between racial groups, particularly when there is a minority racial group in that country that is like which comes from one of the countries that is enforcing this policy in the first place. They are going to promote that animosity, and that is going to create a far less harmonious society within those nations. I'm so proud to oppose.
The problem with opening half is that they're never able to weigh under what conditions certain countries would be willing to sacrifice something such as a national interest in the favor for a collective bargaining power and sort of a collective interest of like a bloc of nations or an international organization, right? We're going to tell you that the pillar on which any functional international organization that is able to take in the interests of several other countries as well as be functional is trust, right? And that trust is built on three main pillars, right? Which we think does not exist in ASEAN right now, right? These pillars are: one, consistent standards in terms of what policy is and how things like trade work within that bloc. Second, contribution that is guaranteed and proportional in terms of what each country has to give to that international organization as a whole. And third, a lack of a power asymmetry in terms of individual countries or individual members of that organization being able to disproportionately dictate the way that organization moves, right? We think that several organizations have failed and have been ineffective in situations where they've failed to do that, and we think that unfortunately ASEAN seems to be moving along that same trend, and we'll prove to you why when we change this, these problems are likely to go away, right? Before I move into extension, some extraneous rebuttal to opening opposition, right? Because look, all they tell you is that consensus is always better, and consensus is something that you'll always reach, right? Without ever telling you why even their own characterization of if their national interests of these countries are so disparate, how that consensus ever comes about if they ever refuse to let go of what their national interests are, right? They never tell you how that consensus comes about in the first place, right? But notice this is even more fundamentally flawed, because their conception of national interest is something that's static, right?
But notice that that's not necessarily how political interests and national interests work, right? National interests work on the basis of what is the best available option present to you right now, right? And right now, in a situation with an ineffective ASEAN that is not able to like build trust or pass policy, that national interest is probably in favor of picking China, right? But notice in the counterfactual world, if we're able to prove that a more effective ASEAN is created that is probably going to give like economic benefits to these people, national interest can be dynamic, can vary, and can lead to situations where they support this new ASEAN and like buy into these things, right? Finally, they tell you that somehow things that are bad in countries are going to become worse because they're going to become more isolationist, right? We're not really sure where if they're able to prove scale of how much things change, right? Because we think that in some of these countries, things are actually really, really bad anyway, right? We think Myanmar being tried in the International Court of Justice for ethnic cleansing, thousands of people being killed in extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, as well as like the strictest interpretation of Sharia law in the world being implemented in Brunei, right? We're not necessarily sure what more isolationism means and where exactly opening opposition is able to prove harms in these situations. We think things are bad enough already, right? Look, we know that right now the point is that these countries might have like populist governments who might want to do things like support China, right? But the idea is that governments come and go, national interests evolve. The idea is creating an international organization that is able to like take care of all of those fluctuations and all of those changes, right? How does that happen? When you let go of individual interests and commit to a certain set of standards that you always will uphold as an international organization, right? In that sense, we envision this new ASEAN to be more than just like having a majoritarian vote, right? We also think that it will have several other things that are similar to an international organization such as say the Eurozone, right? In terms of having like free immigration, in terms of having set standards of labor and regulations in terms of quality of goods, labor laws, contract laws, right? In terms of having certain like regulations over things like currency rates and like having checks on things like fiscal responsibility, right? In terms of having mandatory contributions to the budgets of that organizations, right? Those are individual policies and individual things that ensure three things, right? First, that you know that the contribution to the organization is always being made so that the organization is always equipped to be able to take decisions, right? Not just from a democratic standpoint in terms of voting the way opening government tells you, but also in terms of just financially having a resource pool as well as having a set standards that other countries that want to trade with you can relate to and are able to like form a focal point around, have a set form of standards so that they understand what you're about and understand how you function, right? What that's simply going to do is that it's going to ensure that within the countries that operate in that organization, that the organization can do things, right? That is to say that Vietnam knows that in situations where like it's like GDP output falls in 1 year, they know that slightly more industrialized, stronger countries like Singapore and Malaysia have its back in order to be able to protect it against against other forces such as China that probably want to introduce it with predatory loans, right? That's the situation where you know that there's stability in terms of a rule-wide framework that isn't afraid of being scared of infringing on an individual country's national interests, right? Look, these sort of regulations might not be everyone's cup of tea in the short term, right? But we think over the long term, people are going to adapt to things and things are going to work, right? Why is this unlikely to have some of the problems that the Eurozone has, right? Notice that before that, yeah. Okay.
This characterizes text. Obviously, individual countries will feel they cannot rely on the prospect of their interests always coincide with majority interests going into the future, and at that point they form a bloc with China, because ASEAN is not the only case that shows.
Sure, but look, if we can prove to you that in most cases they're likely going to coincide with the interests of a new ASEAN rather than with China, then they're far more likely to form interests with the new ASEAN, right? Look, what we're trying to tell you is that it's different from the Eurozone because there aren't as many absolute power asymmetries in Southeast Asia as there are in the Eurozone, right? France and Germany are significantly in the factors of tens more richer than countries like Hungary, right? That sort of like absolute disparity doesn't exist in ASEAN, right? As well as like the vast cultural similarities and like a lot of the economic interrelationships that OG talks to you also exist, right? But notice that countries within the ASEAN, countries like Singapore and Malaysia also understand that the EU has had these problems and that Asia itself has been a divided continent for an incredibly long time, right? That's why even if they want certain policies that might screw over smaller countries, they're far more likely to listen to those countries and make these policies slowly and build these regulations through consensus anyway, right? They've never proved to you as to why suddenly like you're not listening to anyone else, right? We think it's in the interest of individual ASEAN countries to be able to listen to those countries, right? We think in those situations where you can ensure trust to those individual countries that this organization works, that's when you best combat China. That's when other actors such as the US recognizes that you're the real deal and support you more in your fight against China. That's when you best protect the interests of Southeast Asian nations. We're proud to propose.
It's lucky that I aggressively matter-craft ASEAN, and I can notice when there is a blatant lack of specificity when we talk about the countries in ASEAN. And that's what the speech is going to do. It's going to change the maybes that exist in the debate, that maybe we can fix these crises, that maybe these countries will leave, to certainty. That is why we take this debate. I'm going to first begin by responding to opening government's mechanism, because opening opposition touched upon it and was able to refute it to some degree, but I think some work needs to be done to fully take them out of the round. Notice that this argument proves capacity for these countries to intervene, but not necessarily likelihood for them to intervene. Here are two responses why there is why that likelihood does not exist. The first reason is that this sets a very dangerous precedent for countries within ASEAN if they abide by this. This exists for twofold. One, countries have a very strong desire to maintain their own national sovereignty, particularly for countries like Thailand, who are very monarchist and who believe in their national sovereignty for that degree, for countries like Malaysia, who have very strong Malaysian national identity. We say they obviously care about their national identity, and there's not something that they'd want to compromise on in the cases of other countries, in case it is extended upon them in the future. But secondly, this stokes old tensions in a way that is truly pernicious, which is to say that there is a lot of infighting within ASEAN historically between Indonesia and Malaysia, between Cambodia and Vietnam, between Malaysia and the Philippines. What this means is it sets up a potential opportunity in the future for a country to capitalize on a previous conflict, for ethnic or historical tensions to resurface. You as a country obviously don't want that. You have an incentive to not make this a precedent. But secondly, intervention is incredibly costly, and there is very little payoff that opening government provides us, other than perhaps the moral discharge of having fixed the Rohingya crisis. We say that countries tend to not operate with the moral intuition that debaters tend to, but also it is extremely costly for countries to send troops into Rohingya and to cooperate and to coordinate intervention there. We say that kind of intervention is likely to happen because it is not in the incentives of these countries. At the end of that point, opening government's mechanism, while clever, does not have likelihood in this debate, which is why it falls out of the round. What am I now going to do? I'm going to co-opt opening government's benefit and explain why we are uniquely able to fix intervention with the maintenance of ASEAN the way that it is. I'm going to use the Rohingya crisis as an example because that is what has been most prevalent in this debate. Let's firstly understand why the Rohingya crisis came about. It is because of complex socio-cultural issues that the Rohingya people are persecuted within Myanmar. There are a myriad of reasons for this. One, they are not the only Muslim group, but they are the least assimilated Muslim group. The reason for that being because people believe them to be illegal immigrants from Bangladesh historically, but also in a war against colonialist imperialism, Rohingya refugees took the side of the British as opposed to everyone else within that country, which has created a rivalry there between the Rohingya people and the majority of the people in Myanmar. Also, there is a history of persecution in these countries from World War II to the extent to which they named one of their operations Clean and Healthy Country in the persecution of the Rohingya people. The reason why that's important is because this is something that is extremely important and extremely close to the heart of these people. It is extremely entrenched. What then does intervention do on their side? Intervention firstly increases the aggression of the country being intervened on. Firstly, because your sovereignty is being compromised, and that is something that you obviously don't like as a country, given that your sovereignty is important. But secondly, it is because, and that incentivizes you to do things like fight back against the interventions that are occurring against you, or to use extended military force on persecuting Rohingyan people, because that is something that you want to do even more than before, because there is opposition to it, because you are being told that your cause is unworthy or unfair. That is something that you will want to do in a higher scale. That makes it harder for these people to escape, but it also makes it harder for soft power to be used, which is the mechanism I will present you in a second. Secondly, people within that country are inflamed and incensed now, because when they feel invaded by foreign forces and their country is being torn away from them, obviously this creates resentment within that country. Obviously this creates militant groups, village vigilantism, and headhunting of Rohingyan people within that country, because people don't want to feel as if their nation is being compromised by foreign forces. But moreover, they blame the Rohingyans for the crisis that is occurring. They blame the Rohingyans for the reason why their country's economy and is being damaged, and the fact that they're being invaded. The mechanism that we prevent you is soft power. Understand that soft power and intervention are mutually exclusive in this debate. The reason for that is because, one, Rohingyan people are going to be blamed for the conflict on their side of the house, which means that the Myanmar institutions of government, but also just the people, are less likely to want to broker a deal that secures their peace. Two, it is extremely unlikely that Bangladesh will want to negotiate a peace agreement in such a chaotic environment, particularly because it probably brings about a lot of violence and a lot of terrorist groups with it. And three, it is extremely difficult to transport refugees to a different country in the midst of chaos. What we can uniquely do on our side of the house is broker a deal with Bangladesh using the same fiat that they have in order to rescue these refugees and to put them in Bangladesh in a way that keeps them safe. Opening opposition told you that there is criticism that currently exists in the Myanmar crisis, which is why we say that the will to do this currently exists, and moreover, countries are incentivized to do it because there is very little cost to them, but they still get the same payoff that open government wanted to talk about. So the weighting for them in terms of value to loss is higher on our side of the house. We are able to get a more concrete fix to the refugee solution than opening government or closing government could, as well as opening opposition not even attempting to try and do that. Go opening.
So soft power is also a form of intervention, and it's slightly already trying to face off Myanmar. But then all you're saying is we don't allow intervention. What are you going to do on your side when you still allow these people to die and still allow ASEAN, the rest of them, to suffer?
So obviously you want, the way that this mechanism works is, it is not a form of intervention because you are brokering a deal with Bangladesh and Myanmar, saying that we are happy to lower tariffs on some of your imports to ASEAN, or we are happy to export at a lower price if you take in these refugees. Obviously, Myanmar might not be thrilled about it, but we say that they are more likely to go along with it, especially because their national sovereignty is not being infringed by an actual intervention. Obviously, that is not analogous to actual intervention. I don't understand what that point is. So the next thing that I want to present is that ASEAN will indeed break apart. Opening opposition talks about a might. I'm going to give you 4 reasons for why Thailand, Philippines, Brunei, and Singapore, Malaysia will leave. Thailand will leave because they have very strong monarchist identity and they align very much with their king. We say that they probably don't want to have their systems of government infringed upon in any capacity by an external force. We say Thailand is likely to leave and secure its own institutions of government. 2, we say that the Philippines has the Duterte dictatorship, and obviously that leader does not want to part with his power. We say that he is likely to leave as well. 3, Brunei is a kingdom. Closing government tells us that they have very strong Sharia law. We say that they probably want to continue to abide by that, as opposed to conceding to ASEAN. They are likely to leave as well. 4thly, Malaysia and Indonesia have the largest militaries in these areas. They are the ones who are likely to have to do all of the intervention work. They probably don't want to have to undergo that cost. They are likely to leave as well. At the end of this debate, we are the only team in this debate to have actually given you concrete reasons for why countries will leave ASEAN, why we are able to save the Rohingya crisis. We win this debate.
Panel, firstly, a couple of responses to closing opposition, and then I'm going to tell you why our case uniquely wins this debate. They have one singular conception conception of the case, which is just interventions, right? Firstly, they'll tell you that under our organization and setup, all conceptions of sovereignty vanish and we're going to continuously have interventions, etc. That's not really how most international organizations, contrary to ASEAN, still work, right? Even when you have things like majority ruling, there is consideration for sovereignty, and we don't see why all of that is lost. In terms of probably compromise and finding out the best possible outcome for that, right? And additionally, notice how small in terms of impact their case is, right? The only country that is probably under threat of intervention, again, as an absolute last resort, which we will tell you why you will probably not need, is Myanmar, right? They have to tell us why most countries in the ASEAN are under threat of intervention, and notice that if a country is committing ethnic cleansing, they will be under threat of intervention anyway by, say, foreign powers, etc. So we're not really sure how exactly that changes on their side of the house, right? So at best, what they've managed to prove, and they still haven't, as I'm going to tell you, is that one country, Myanmar, might leave the ASEAN, right? And additionally, they propose to you solutions to, say, the Rohingya refugee crisis, right? Notice that opposition bench as a whole has only managed to prove absolutely minimal or inconsequential benefits to the Rohingya crisis themselves, right? Things like getting Aung San Suu Kyi out of house arrest, but all of the violations and genocide is still continuing to do so. That is absolutely because things like sovereignty are prioritized and they don't have a solution to that. And things like, oh, maybe other countries can take up refugees and we can strike deals with them. Say, within ASEAN itself, a lot of countries, say, around the world consider, say, the influx of massive refugees, again, a threat to their sovereignty. So I don't see why that deal can be brokered and eventually they'll be able to solve the crisis, right? Absolutely no mechanism by which they solve the problem they've identified themselves. But moving on to the questions in this debate and how we uniquely win this, right? So OG gives you some form of mechanism, but the critical thing we think in this debate is to analyze incentives of different countries within ASEAN, and at the end of the day, why they have the incentive to stay and will in fact be powerful, right? We present to you this uniquely in the form of economic benefits by highlighting particular standards that will be implemented, right? And also we think a big question in this debate is the issue of China, right? Opening government just asserts that, oh, that everything, all countries will stay together and we can offset China by this, right? But they were still uncomparative to opposition in that sense, and they cannot claim the benefit of China until they prove the integrity of ASEAN, right? So what exactly do we tell you is the incentive to stay, right? It's in terms of economic integration, right? And a key question that no team has been able to answer in this debate is why countries, say, probably would prioritize economic benefits over political ones, right? The only incentive OG gives you is that, oh, they're interconnected and will still continue to be interconnected, right? Notice that's only the case when things like sovereignty still exists. So for a marginal, say, maybe compromise of sovereignty, and once, say, the comparative changes for these countries, they haven't weighed out what this is, right? So we think that the reason why, one, they may still prioritize economic benefits over things like sovereignty and not with the change of status quo is we think inherently that economic benefits are a causation of leading to more stability within countries, right? That means things like more support for governments, and even their, say, political incentives of staying in power is also maintained on our side of the house. So if we prove to you that ASEAN as a whole will stay together, and one, there are going to be more economic benefits as a whole, we think they're more than willing to prioritize economic benefits over political incentives by virtue of stability, right? But how exactly do we get more investment economically and integration? But before that, I'll take opening.
Your economic integration benefit is premised upon states making a rational way of cost and benefits and committing to the new ASEAN. But our material directly defeats this because we explain that states respond irrationally and in a nationalistic fashion. The domestic political incentives that point in that direction will mean they will not be able to get to your organization.
Yeah, so the premise of our case is more more economic benefits means more stability, which means like political incentives are also maintained, right? But like that's my next clash on how we're going to have more economic incentives, right? Like we think that once standards are implemented, there is certainty of investment for a lot of countries, even foreign powers and even say more well-off countries within the ASEAN, right? And we think that even countries within the ASEAN recognize that they only have power at the point at which like the ASEAN stays together in terms of having more bargaining power in international organizations, having more bargaining power against China. So what exactly do we implement in terms of certainty of investment, right? Like standards, like you have to do like labor standards, etc., and even like economic standards will be imposed, which means there will be a certainty of investment. This means that well-off countries like Malaysia and Singapore will contribute to the, say, lesser well-off countries more than they did in status quo, because they know, because there is a certainty of investment and they know that the countries have to abide by this by majority rule, and there is possibility of this happening, right? And once that happens, we do think that these smaller countries even get more benefits and will stay in this organization as a result of that, right? We think investment equal to trust, because that translates into economic benefits themselves, right? So we think that the incentive to contribute and collaborate for even well-off countries increases, because there is surety in terms of the policy being passed, and they don't have to say wait for consensus, etc., for that, and they can get these investments like passed easier, right? So again, more investment does mean more trust, and this means that different countries within ASEAN will stay within that. That does mean that more bargaining power against China and possibility of more investments even from foreign companies and states like the United States, right? So the overall effect of a conglomerated organization is the fact that there is going to be more bargaining power and more economic benefits. Proud to propose.